On behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Justin Stearns. I'm the head of the Arab Crossroads Studies program and Associate Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies here. I also have the distinct pleasure of being one of the co-conveners of the Conference on Islam and Global Perspective that's going on at NYU Abu Dhabi right now. And our conference is the result of an international and interdisciplinary research with our dear colleagues from the Organization for Islamic Area Studies at Waseda University in Japan, Tokyo, and the Asia-Europe Institute at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. And this conference is bringing together scholars from all over the world to explore the nature and salience of Islam and Muslim communities from a truly global perspective. While journalists and political pundits have often described trans-regional Islamic movements as primarily political or militant, this conference is exploring cultural, social, and scholarly aspects to trans-regional and global Muslim communities. We're approaching this question through lenses such as migration, trans-regionalism, transmission of scientific knowledge, while acknowledging the conceptual tension between global and local and universal, in particular, identities and practices. So we are therefore especially delighted to welcome Professor Mayanthi Fernando from the University of California, Santa Cruz tonight, where she is Associate Professor of Anthropology. Now, Professor Fernando, whom we have the distinct pleasure of seeing here in NYU Abu Dhabi for the first time, received her PhD from the University of Chicago and is the recipient of numerous fellowships from, among others, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the Fulbright, and the Social Science Research Council. Her research examines the conflicts, ethical and political practices and forms of community generated at the intersection of the Islamic and secular Republican traditions in contemporary France. So her first book, The Republic Unsettled, Muslim French and the Contradictions of Secularism, which came out with Duke in 2014, alternates between an analysis of Muslim French politics, ethics, and social life, and the contradictions of French secularity, laïcité, and this new Muslim subjectivity reflects and refracts. It explores how Muslim French draw on both Islamic and secular Republican traditions as they create new modes of ethical and political engagement, reconfiguring those traditions to imagine a future for France. In doing so, it also examines how the institutions, political and legal practices and dominant discourses that comprise French secularity regulate and govern and profoundly disrupt Muslim life. It traces a series of long-standing tensions imminent to laïcité, tensions not so much generated as precipitated by the presence of Muslim French. And it argues ultimately that the so-called Muslim question is actually a question about secularism. So, without any further ado and without wanting to put her work into my words, I would like to pass the microphone to Professor Fernando for what I am sure will be a very stimulating presentation. Professor Fernando, thank you for coming all the way from California and traveling literally around the world. We are very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
I should first apologize. I'm battling a cold, and so I'm going to be sort of drinking as many fluids as I possibly can while I do this talk. Let me also thank Martin Klimke and Justin Stearns and the entire NYU Abu Dhabi team for this invitation. I'm going to talk, the talk that I'm going to give is drawn from, as Justin mentioned, my recent book, The Republic Unsettled, Muslim French and the Contradictions of Secularism, which came out about 6 months ago. And I want to begin by taking you back to a moment from my fieldwork in France. It's April 2003, and I'm at the annual Congress of the Union of Islamic Organizations of France, or UOIF, a prominent national Muslim association. We are at Le Bourget, a convention center on the northern outskirts of Paris. About 80,000 other people are also attending the 4-day event. In the crowded market hall, attendees peruse everything from prayer mats to video cassette sermons, some in Arabic, most in French, to Islamic clothing, which ranges from traditional abayas to hip-hop style tracksuits by the Muslim company Dawaware. Men and women stand in line at the fatwa tent, where religious scholars affiliated with the UOIF respond to individuals' queries. Visitors from out of town sleep in sex-segregated dormitories fashioned out of former airplane hangars, now strewn with sleeping bags and blankets. As always, the Congress also features 4 days of panels by Muslim intellectuals, activists, and religious scholars. And those were just slides from the 2003 Congress. On April 20th, 2003, Farid Abdelkrim takes the stage. He's introduced as a founding member and former president of the Young Muslims of France, or JMF, one of the satellite organizations of the UOIF responsible for youth affairs. Built like a rugby player and dressed neatly in a black shirt and black trousers, Farid immediately establishes a sense of familiarity with his public, alternating between joking self-deprecation and an aggressive, sometimes haranguing exhortation of the audience. And this is his style both on and off stage, I discover. That Sunday afternoon, Farid invokes his dead father, who had come from a small village in Algeria to work for the National Railway as a rail track layer. He speaks eloquently and forcefully about the need for historical memory, reminding his audience that, and I quote, "Our parents built this country on their backs." He then turns to the present day. "Stop talking to me about integration," he thunders to wild applause. "I am here and I am French. France is my homeland. The Republic is mine. La France est mon bled. La République est la mienne." He urges the crowd to choose the party they prefer and to vote in municipal, regional, and national elections. He then suddenly demands, half in jest, half serious, "Would you vote for me if I were Interior Minister?" This is a reference to Nicolas Sarkozy, Interior Minister at the time and later President of France, who had spoken the evening before. At this point, the huge crowd roars in appreciation, and many people, most of them in their 20s and 30s, rise to give Farid a standing ovation as older members of the UOIF look on in consternation and try to get the crowd to sit down. Farid ends his speech with the booming call for civic and political action. Engagement, engagement, engagement. My talk this evening is an attempt to think through this moment by heeding Farid's demand that we stop talking about integration, a demand echoed by many Muslim French, even as the framework of integration and Muslims' supposed lack of integration remains the most common way for politicians and scholars to think about France, about Islam in France. Instead, I want to take seriously Farid's. Apparently, the dominant discourse has interrupted me. I'm not sure what's happening. Let me just pause while. Apparently, I've upset the powers that be just by beginning. Okay, and can we go back? Can we go back to the slides at some point, or? Because this is just a blank slide. Okay, there we go. Okay, all right. So instead, I want to take seriously Farid's and other Muslims' claims to France as their homeland, their bled, and to think about the political imagination and sense of citizenship that accompanies this claim. And even if this Muslim French political imagination remains at the level of aspiration, I nonetheless find it productive to think with, to see my interlocutors as theorists of the future, to use my ethnography of Muslim French activists as an occasion to reflect on citizenship, public religiosity, and political possibility in France. By Muslim French, I mean a generation of young people, many of them the children and grandchildren of Maghrebi laborers, like Farid's father, recruited to build France after World War II. Muslim French are those committed to practicing both Islam and citizenship, that is, to practicing Islam as French citizens and practicing French citizenship as pious Muslims. This generation is part of an Islamic revival that began in France in the 1990s, witnessed in the proliferation of Islamic bookstores and publishing houses, men and women in modest Muslim dress, the construction of mosques, and the enormous growth of local Muslim civic associations. Given the revival's span over a few decades, some Muslim French are no longer so young, and those who founded the first Muslim civic associations in the 1990s are in their early 40s. Nonetheless, they represent a distinctive generational shift from the sensibilities of their immigrant parents. As I will show over the course of this talk, Muslim French refuse to relegate what they consider a fundamental aspect of their identity, their Muslimness, to the private sphere, asserting their right to be piously and visibly Muslim in the public sphere. They do so, and this is what makes them distinct from their parents' generation, they do so by defining their Muslimness as always already French. They thereby contest a dominant political discourse where Muslim means not French and French means not Muslim. Moreover, by reconfiguring the relationship between Frenchness and Muslimness, Muslim French also imagine new ways of organizing the national polity, envisioning a future for France that does not constrain Muslimness to the space of difference. Muslim French stake a claim to France, we should remember, within and against a legal, political, and discursive context in which Muslims are increasingly figured as threats to French national identity. And I don't have time to go into the kind of rampant Islamophobia, but I'm just going to give you one example. Consider, for example, a town hall meeting that was part of the 2009 grand debate on national identity, inaugurated by the center-right UMP party that took as its focus so-called Muslim communalism. In December of 2009, Nadine Morano, then Secretary of State for Family and Solidarity, responded to a two-part question from a member of the audience about whether Islam really has a place within French national identity. Morano began by affirming, and I quote her, "There should not be one person superior to another, so the other has to make an effort at assimilation. C'est à l'autre de faire l'effort de cette assimilation." She then noted that our French roots are Judeo-Christian, before acknowledging the 1905 law of church-state separation, which, she said, guarantees our respect for Protestant churches, synagogues, and now mosques. Note the dominant unmarked Catholic here, our. Morano went on to invoke the various rules, or règles, for coming to France, including, she asserted, regularized papers that ensure that one is working and not relying on welfare, as well as the need to reinforce legislative measures, and I quote her again, for those who don't respect our laws in certain neighborhoods. She added, and I'm quoting her again, she added, "One must respect the other as soon as he respects the law, as soon as he respects the terms of his entry into France," and she uses the term contrat d'accueil, which means literally entry contract, as long as he respects equality between men and women, as long as he doesn't accept the burqa, as long as he accepts our traditions. Referencing the hypothetical situation of a young Muslim, Morano declared, and I quote her once more, "What I want is that he love France because he lives in this country, that he find a job, that he not speak in slang, that he not wear his baseball cap backwards. But I believe that living together when one is young, there is nothing more beautiful in terms of hope." Morano's rambling 8-minute monologue, and it really was truly rambling, her 8-minute monologue reveals many of the slippages and underlying tropes in mainstream French political and media discourse about Muslims. Note, for example, the way in which Morano seamlessly moves from a discussion of secularism and minority religion's place in France to the legal requirements for immigration, to delinquency, then back to religion, then to French norms and traditions, then to the proverbial young Muslim and his inveterate social deviance, and apparently also terrible fashion sense. Note, too, the way in which Islam and Muslims are consistently expelled from France and rendered literally other. Morano uses the word l'autre, or other, 5 times during the 8-minute speech. Muslims are rendered other first through her remark about France's Judeo-Christian heritage, and then through the way in which she always positions Muslims as outsiders, as foreigners and immigrants to be accepted by France only on the condition that they abide by our laws and accept our traditions. Her use of the term entry contract, contrat d'accueil, assumes either that there are no Muslims who can claim France as their country of citizenship, or that even for those who can, their citizenship is conditional, a legal contract rather than a cultural fact. Morano's speech is representative of a public and political discourse that consistently amalgamates immigration, delinquency, communalism, terrorism, and Islam to construct Muslim and French as intractably opposed identities. And the exclusion of Muslims is not only discursive. Anti-Muslim discrimination exists in the labor market. Studies show, for example, that Muslim-sounding names are rejected on that basis alone. It also exists in the justice system and in the national education system. Meanwhile, the denigration of Islam and Muslims in media and political discourse is commonplace, and legal measures that target various forms of supposed Muslim deviancy, including various forms of veiling, have multiplied. As the French sociologists Abdel Ali Hajat and Marwan Mohammed argue, the combination of microaggressions, structural discrimination, legal sanction, and discursive disparagement make Islamophobia what they call a total social fact. All this serves to exclude Muslims from France, both symbolically and physically, rendering them conditional French citizens, if citizens at all. When Muslim French like Farid stake their claim to France, then, they do so within and against a discursive and institutional context in which Muslim means not French and French means not Muslim. Yet claiming Frenchness is precisely what Muslim French do, inserting themselves into a symbolic and political space that otherwise excludes them. The claims that Muslim French make to France, and the grounding of those claims in the paradigm of citizenship were strikingly displayed during a December 2003 demonstration against the then proposed law banning headscarves in public schools. About 3,000 or 4,000 demonstrators, mostly young women, many of them clad in blue, white, and red headscarves, marched from the Place de la République to the Place de la Bastille, chanting slogans and holding placards, all in French. One sign read, "School, my path; the veil, my choice; France, my right." A number of the young women held aloft their national identity cards and their voter registration cards. Some of the young women at the head of the cortege had faded French flags wrapped around poles in the fashion of the revolutionary period. As we approached the Bastille, a message rippled through the crowd. The few hundred men were told to get out of the procession as the women were going to storm the Bastille. Whereupon a number of young women climbed atop the base of the gilded column that marks the site of the former prison, the storming of which symbolically constitutes the founding moment of the Revolutionary Republic. Through these various means, wearing blue, white, and red, holding aloft national identity cards and voter registration cards, storming the Bastille, through these means, the women in this demonstration inscribed themselves into the French nation, presenting themselves as classical citoyennes or citizens, adorned not only with the symbolic trappings of the citizen, the flag, but also with the practical tools of active citizenship, the national identity card and the voter registration card. That gesture of inscribing Muslims into the founding moment of the Republic was repeated in 2012 by the Collective Against Islamophobia in France in its Nous sommes aussi la nation campaign, We are also the nation campaign. One of the images in a series of advertisements, which the Paris Transit Authority refused to display because of its religious character and political demands, one of these images reimagines painter Jacques-Louis David's Revolution-era tennis court oath. The oath was a pledge signed by members of the Third Estate refusing to disband until a new constitution had been written. It was the first time French citizens formally stood in opposition to Louis XVI. The new image depicts the tennis court oath in the present, with veiled women, Arab men in hoodies, and visibly Orthodox Jews, among other citizens, holding aloft French flags and copies of the oath. This image does not merely represent, but also enacts the Muslim French claim to France as a right of citizenship, depicting Muslims as original revolutionary citizens. This Muslim French claim to France as their homeland also entails a concerted effort to Frenchify or franciser the Islamic tradition institutionally, exegetically, and culturally. Franciser was a term used by Mounia and Shiraz, two sisters in their early 20s whose parents emigrated from Tunisia to the city of Nantes in the 1960s. The sisters had created an innovative head covering that looks less like a traditional headscarf and more like a soft cloth fedora with a neck scarf attached. In explaining the motivation for their sartorial creation, Mounia claimed it was a way to adapt and to integrate. Shiraz disagreed vehemently. "What am I integrating into? I'm French," she said. Mounia contended that Shiraz had misunderstood her point, that though covering the head, neck, and ears remains an obligation for Muslim women, the precise form that covering takes can be culturally specific. Muslim French women therefore needed to franciser the headscarf. "We're not in Iran, we're not in Egypt, we're not in Tunisia, we're in France," Mounia said. She was not arguing that Muslims are not integrated into French society and need to adapt, which is a common refrain among non-Muslims, but rather that because practicing Muslims like her are already French, they need to act like it and not adopt dress styles from the Middle East or the Maghreb. Munya's reasoning draws implicitly on one of the major interpretive trends within the modernist and reformist currents of the contemporary Islamic revival, namely the abstraction of Islam into the sight of fundamental principles and universal values like justice, equality, and rationality that are instantiated differently in different historical and cultural contexts. Best exemplified in Europe by theologian Tariq Ramadan, who himself draws on a much longer interpretive tradition concerning the relationship between divine and human law. This position takes the Sharia as the immutable, revealed path of God, and fiqh as the human articulation of the Sharia, and therefore always dynamic, always evolving according to changing circumstances. By underscoring the historicity of Islamic jurisprudence, Ramadan, who is widely read by Muslim French, including most of my interlocutors, Ramadan is able to move to a consideration of Islam in Europe where circumstances quite different from those in majority Muslim regions necessitate, he argues, new approaches, new concepts, new fiqh. Though Islam is universal, indeed because Islam is universal, Ramadan contends, and I quote him, there should be an Islam rooted in the cultural universe of Europe, just as there exists an Islam rooted in African or Asian traditions. Islam and its Islamic references is one and unique. The methods of judicial application are, however, differentiated, and its concretization, Islam's concretization in a given place and a given time is by nature plural, unquote. One of the most interesting effects of Ramadan's theology is the way in which, by making Islam the site of the universal, he also locates France as the site of the particular, of culture, thereby turning on its head the common secular republican paradigm in which France is universal and Islam is particular as race, religion, or culture. According to Ramadan's framework, there exists no incompatibility between being French and being Muslim because those French values that are universal, liberty, equality, and fraternity, for example, are already encompassed by the Islamic tradition, and those that are particular, i.e. particular cultural practices and particular instantiations of these universal values, these are already shared by Muslims by dint of their being French. The irony, of course, is that most French Republicans balk at the notion that their universal values are those of Islam and therefore shared by Muslims. In other words, it is precisely when Muslim French accept the universality of many Republican values that the Republican universal comes crashing down to the particular always contained within. Importantly, these Muslim French claims to France do not imply a break with the past and with a complicated history that inextricably links France to Algeria, its former settler colony, and to Morocco and Tunisia, its former protectorates. Recall Farid's declaration that La France est mon bled, a declaration with various layers of meaning. Bled is an Arabic word that means both village and homeland. On the face of it, then, by declaring France as his bled, Farid makes a strong claim of national belonging, averring that France, rather than Algeria, is his homeland, and marking a clear distinction between the national cultural sensibilities of his parents' generation, whose bled is overseas, and his own generation, whose bled is very much France. Yet even as he makes this distinction, his use of the term bled simultaneously Arabizes France, seamlessly configuring it as a Muslim Maghrebi space. In fact, the term bled has entered the French lexicon used by non-Maghrebi French to refer to their native village or region in France. Farid's use of the phrase calls attention to the way in which the metropolitan presence of Maghrebi French like him and his parents and the ensuing linguistic, cultural, and religious pluralism has brought about a new France. The new France imagined by Muslim French is also an old France, however. Muslim French ground their claim to France, my right, if you recall from the demonstration, they ground their claim to France not only in their birth and education there, but also in the fact that their grandparents fought and died in France's colonial armies during the two world wars, as well as in the fact that their parents worked to rebuild France in the period after World War II. Recall Farid's phrasing, our parents built this country on their backs. Farid once pointed out that individuals like him were not present in France by accident. It's not like we got lost along the way, he said. On ne s'est pas trompé de route, he said, referring to France's colonization of the Maghreb and its active recruitment of Maghrebi laborers to France in the 20th century. People have to realize that, Farid continued, and France has to assume its destiny. By staking a claim to France through their ancestors, Muslim French like Farid reconnect French colonial history to the nation's present and future, transforming conventional notions of French history by positing not only their present, but also their past, their ancestors, the Arabs and Berbers, as an integral part of France's national historical narrative, not just of their own particular history. To reweave the histories of France and Algeria together is not simply to make a historical claim, however, but also to reconceptualize the present and the future of France. The historicity inscribed into Muslim French politics also presupposes what I would call a futurity. France does not simply have to assume its past, but also, as Farid noted, its destiny. Indeed, the two are ineluctably linked. Thus, the aim of Muslim French attention to France's colonial genealogy is not, as many secular Republican critics anxiously and angrily contend, to make the Republic atone for its past, but rather to enable all French to imagine the present and the future more capaciously. By conjuring forth a new political imagination for the future, one that emerges out of the historical and contemporary realities of France, Muslim French implicitly reversed the accusation of communalism or neo-tribalism, communautarisme, that is consistently directed against them by mainstream French Republicans and scholars. They reveal Republicans as those incapable of recognizing France for what it was, and therefore what it is and what it could be. Through this reversal, Republicans become those with a meager grasp of history, a narrow understanding of community, and consequently an impoverished political imagination. The French Republican tradition, we should remember, constitutes itself and its authority by establishing a powerful sense of political and cultural continuity of French identity over time, positing an unbroken link that stretches back certainly to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and often all the way to Charlemagne. A recent book titled Proud to be French, Fier d'être Français, by novelist and popular historian Max Gallo, which was published in 2006, for example, begins with an epigraph from the medieval poem Chanson de Roland to produce a continuous notion of French identity stretching back to the 11th century. Such continuity erases the purposeful construction of modern France through various military, political, and legal operations. We should remember that until the mid-19th century, most people refused to identify with the nation. They held on to village loyalties and spoke regional languages rather than French. Indeed, at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, only 11% of the population of what we now know as France used French as their first language. In fact, in southern regions like Gascony and Provence, the name France referred to a small area with Paris at its center. There was no France. The notion of contemporary France as a homogeneous and historically continuous nation is therefore a complete fiction. Yet the sense of continuity so often conjured by Republicans enables them to posit the Republican model of citizenship, which ostensibly does not recognize subnational differences and disallows public expressions of communal attachment. It allows them to posit this model as quintessentially French. By undoing this continuity, or to be more precise, by radically expanding it to such an extent that continuity and rupture become difficult to disentangle, Muslim French like Farid do two things I want to propose. First, they disrupt the familiar story told not just across the political spectrum in France, but in much scholarly work as well. They disrupt the familiar story that Muslims are new arrivals via post-colonial immigration, hence the need for their integration into secular society. Muslim French attention to history forces us to remember that Muslims have long been present in France, and moreover integral to its development as a nation. Many scholars have shown how modern France and its colonial outposts were constituted together, with the colonies often serving as blueprints or staging grounds for forms of modern government in the metropole. Significantly, from 1830 to 1962, Algeria and its population, its enormous population of Muslims, was an essential part of France. Algeria was not a protectorate, it was not an overseas department, and it was not a territory governed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs like many other colonies, but rather a series of départements akin to other metropolitan departments. Algeria was a part of France. Second, Muslim French disrupt the conventional narrative of the French legal and political system as unitary. After all, legal pluralism, understood as anathema to French Republican secularism or laïcité, legal pluralism flourished in Algeria, which had separate legal systems for Kabyles, Arab Muslims, and Jews, a situation deemed entirely compatible at the time with political republicanism. In fact, the entire French Empire functioned through a variegated legal and political system. Not only were assorted imperial outposts, including Indochina, Algeria, Senegal, Mauritius, Guadeloupe, Pondicherry, and Tahiti, all these were governed differently from each other, but even within a single political unit, distinct legal regimes applied to distinct populations. Algeria was not unique in this way. And even in the present, France is not one, and this applies to its much vaunted model of secularism, or laïcité. 8 different legal regimes organize relations between state and religion in metropolitan and overseas France. In the northeastern region of Alsace-Moselle, for example, the 1905 law separating church and state never went into effect, and the region continues to be governed by a Napoleon-era concordat system with 4 recognized religions subsidized by the state. Muslim French attention to history undercuts the narrative of a republican one and indivisible. And in so doing, Muslim French interrupt the tight relation between contemporary republican politics and Frenchness, refusing to cede control of the definition of authentic French citizenship to secular republicans. Indeed, one major element of this historicist, futurist project of reconfiguring France, of imagining citizenship otherwise, entails the normalization of the practice of Islam, including its public practice, as simply one more way of being French. Note the precise nature of this reconfiguration. Muslim French, like Farid, do not simply contend that one can be both French and Muslim, that practicing Islam and being a French citizen are compatible. Rather, Muslim French make the more radical claim that Muslim is French. By claiming that Muslim is French, Muslim French put into question any neat separation between public and private, politics and religion, and universal in particular, separations that republican citizenship and French secularism both constantly demand and consistently contravene. By refusing even to attempt to make themselves invisible, which is of course an impossible task, and by demanding why their Muslimness is subsequently read as excessively visible, Muslim French reveal the particular racial and religious attachments embedded within the republican universal and within the supposedly neutral public sphere. But beyond merely unmasking universalist citizenship, republican citizenship, as actually particular, as white and Christian or post-Christian, they also propose a new political horizon, making it possible to imagine as equally French other ways of organizing the national polity. In fact, and this is what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk, one of the effects of this reimagining of France by Muslim French is a reimagining of the relationship between difference and citizenship. Foregoing the dominant binaries of assimilation and difference that underpin much debate about Islam and Muslims in France, Muslim French call not for their right to difference, but for their right to indifference. Now, politicians and public intellectuals in France and scholars in France and elsewhere usually interpret the Islamic revival and Muslim French activism as a demand for the recognition of or right to Muslim difference. Yet many of my Muslim French interlocutors rejected this framing, and Farid did so most explicitly. Slogans like the right, and I'm quoting him here, slogans like the right to difference, he declared, contribute to the idea that we are still not entirely French, we are still separate. I don't want the right to difference. I want the right to indifference. Je veux pas le droit à la différence, je veux le droit à l'indifférence. That is to say, I don't want people to pay attention to me. I want to be forgotten. To make complete sense of Farid's declaration, let me give you a brief history of French politics about citizenship and minority difference. After various experiments in the 1970s with a number of policy frameworks for dealing with North African immigrants and their children in France, the 1981 electoral victory by the Socialist Party ushered in an era of the right to difference, le droit à la différence. Over the next few years, the right to difference became a politically acceptable rallying cry for ethnocultural immigrant movements who were able to articulate their right to cultural difference without seeming to threaten the integrity of the French nation. By the mid-1980s, however, the right to difference had been abandoned, even by the left, as a result of its recuperation by the extreme right National Front Party, which turned the right to difference argument on its head, claiming that France, too, had a right to its own cultural purity, free from the polluting influences of Muslim North African and West African residents. Thereafter emerged a remarkable consensus between both the left and the right, promoting the primacy of the Republican model of integration that refuses, at least in theory, that refuses to recognize any subnational, ethnic, racial, religious, or cultural attachments. In this political context, the public expression of Muslimness, as well as various demands by Muslims for state-funded private schools, Muslim private schools, for the right to wear headscarf in public schools, and for the incorporation of Muslim holy days in the national school calendar, all of these are interpreted by most Republicans as demands for the recognition and institutional accommodation of Muslim difference. And this should sound familiar, this notion of the right to Muslim difference. Most French Republicans believe these demands contravene both French secularism and French citizenship. While these politicians and public intellectuals dominate public debate in France, a number of other public figures have drawn on Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's influential notion of the politics of recognition to criticize a repressive republicanism hostile to difference and to call for a more inclusive republic open to the recognition of religious, cultural, and racial difference. These figures see the Islamic revival as a reclamation and reiteration of Muslim difference and as a demand for the public visibility and acknowledgement of that difference. As a consequence, they find that the best political framework for dealing with Muslim minorities entails the public recognition and accommodation of Muslim difference. Now, I don't want to reduce the assimilationist position represented by most mainstream Republicans to the far more inclusivist politics of recognition framework. But I nonetheless want to highlight how both positions continue to mark Islam as a sign or practice of difference in and from France. While certainly more open to public Muslim religiosity than assimilationist republicanism, the right to difference position continues to privilege a very traditional idea of France that positions Muslimness as a form of difference or otherness from the norm. Though seemingly opposed then, these two political paradigms share the binary of assimilation versus difference. They diverge only in thinking about how to manage so-called Muslim difference. The former calls for assimilation, the latter for limited recognition. In other words, even an inclusivist politics recognizing Muslim difference reproduces certain ways of being and thinking as different and leaves dominant norms and assumptions intact. Farid's intervention, I want to argue, bypasses this entirely. By insisting on his right to indifference, Farid invokes his right to be unremarked by others, yet on terms that do not require his assimilation into majority religious, cultural, and racial norms. In so doing, he departs from both the dominant assimilationist framework of Republican integration and the emerging framework that proposes instead to recognize difference. Farid attempts, in other words, to reframe the current debate about so-called Muslim difference, and his attempt resonates with many Muslim French. In contrast to the politics of Republican integration, which demands that Muslims restrict their particularity, in this case their religiosity, to the private sphere, Muslim French like Farid seek to publicly inhabit their non-normative identities, conventionally understood as their difference. Yet in contrast to a differentialist politics, they do not want their difference to be recognized as such. Echoing Farid, many Muslim French would tell me how tired they were of the various ways in which their difference, their non-belonging, was reinforced through conceivably neutral labels like of immigrant origin, issu de l'immigration, or of Arab Maghrebi origin, right? D'origine arabe, d'origine maghrébine. What Muslim French call for then is the indifference to difference, such that difference is neither abstracted nor overdetermined, rendered neither invisible nor hypervisible. Muslim French demand the right to be visible but unremarkable, put simply, the right to be. Although the term unremarkable may seem an odd choice of word on my part, I think it captures both the Muslim French desire to be unremarked upon, as well as the desire to represent an unexceptional occurrence in French public space, their Muslimness an ordinary form of being French. Houria Boutelja, a founding member of the radical Natives of the Republic Party, put it this way: we want the right to be ordinary. On veut le droit d'être banal. That desire to be ordinary propels many Muslim French to claim the public practice of Islam not as a right to difference, but rather as an entitlement of equal citizenship. Instead of occupying the place of difference within a more tolerant and inclusive France, the kind of positioning imagined by many French and North American public intellectuals who have called for the recognition and accommodation of Muslim difference as the solution to the cultural and political marginalization of Muslims, rather than occupying the place of difference, Muslim French argue that they are not different, but rather French. For those theorists theorizing explicitly about the right to indifference, or the right to be ordinary, that right takes two specific forms. The first is best exemplified by Boutelja, who referenced her right to banality in the middle of a conversation about homophobia among Muslims. She was describing her group's decision not to work actively with progressive queer rights organizations like the Pink Panthers, as a number of other Muslim French organizations have done, noting that her group's ostensible base would not understand nor approve of such alliances. And whether that's true or not is debatable. Boutelja was quite frank about the casual homophobia she ascribed to much of the Muslim Maghrebi community, but she wanted to know why this homophobia was any more problematic than that of any other community, and why Muslim homophobia should constitute a citizenship deficit rather than merely a form of intolerance, a citizenship deficit in a way that Catholic or Jewish or secular, I would add secular Republican homophobia does not, right? After all, almost half of France opposed the recent legalization of same-sex marriage without anyone accusing them of being unintegrated or not proper citizens. In asserting the right to banality, Boutelja was insisting that homophobic attitudes among Maghrebi origin French, just as criminal or delinquent acts by citizens and residents of Maghrebi descent, these should not be treated any differently from forms of homophobia, criminality, or delinquency practiced by so-called Français de souche, or native French. She was questioning, in other words, why problem behavior like homophobia on the part of Muslims and Franco-Maghrebis should signify a lack of Frenchness and consequently provoke the threat of expulsion when similar behavior on the part of non-Muslims, including a large part of the center-right UMP party and the entire Catholic Church, remains utterly unremarkable. The second, somewhat different articulation of the right to indifference concerns the right of Muslims to participate in French society and shape its general interest as much as any other citizen. As Yunus of the Collective of French Muslims, or CMF, declared, and I quote, "If one is a French citizen of Muslim faith, un citoyen français de confession musulmane, that means that all spaces of dialogue, of debate, of social transformation, all these spaces concern us," unquote. Unlike Boutelja's notion of indifference, then, which seems to demand the indifference to difference but leaves intact the organization of center, i.e. white France, and periphery, i.e. the spaces of discrete ethnic, racial, and religious difference, Yunus, as well as most of the Muslim French activists I knew, seek to disrupt the very notion of difference itself, understanding difference not as deviation, but rather as variation. In other words, they imagine the national polity as cross-cut by a multiplicity of differences without any essential form of non-difference or majority. Yunus's spatial metaphor, recall he said all these spaces concern us, Yunus's spatial metaphor collapses the distinction between general and particular and between center and periphery that undergirds both the Republican model of integration and the differentialist politics of recognition. Yunus's declaration has two connected meanings. First, as he explicitly announces, Muslim French can and should intervene in French society as a whole and not only in their particular communities. And that's a fairly sort of palatable understanding of what he means. But second, and I think this is more interesting, more radical, second, he implicitly argues that even when acting within their own particular community, Muslim French are always already intervening within France more broadly, since Muslim French are, by definition, French. Now, in articulating the political vision of Muslim French, and I'm going to go back to the slide so that you can sort of look at it more and more, and we can talk about it later. In articulating the political vision of Muslim French, I find it helpful to reflect on American political philosopher Danielle Allen's distinction between the metaphor of oneness and the metaphor of wholeness in conceptions of the nation. Though oneness is often used as the main metaphor to describe a people or a nation, one people, one nation, Allen proposes instead the metaphor of wholeness. The commitment to oneness, she argues, has often entailed practices that make citizens who are not part of the one people politically invisible. Wholeness offers a different vision, she contends, since the word whole can encompass multiplicity in a way that one cannot. Many Muslim French, I want to propose, share a similar vision of the nation. Countering the oneness-oriented France propagated by most Republicans, a oneness inscribed into the French Constitution, which affirms the Republic as one and indivisible, even though, as I've just noted, it clearly is not, many Muslim French envision the community of citizens through the metaphor of wholeness. That polity is a space that cultivates heterogeneity rather than homogeneity, including the possibility of radical and incommensurable heterogeneities. It allows those formerly invisible or hypervisible, those too conspicuously visible, to be simply visible, that is, to be citizens. Imagining the Republic as plural explodes the national polity into various cross-sections of equally different differences in a way that fundamentally undoes the existing configuration of identity and difference, majority and minority, center and periphery. As a consequence, difference is conceptualized not in relation to a center, which no longer exists in this framework, but rather in relation to various other identities or differences, such that non-dominant ways of life can be recognized without being classified as essentialized difference. Too often, within the framework of the right to difference, identity and difference are taken as essential characteristics reproducing a center, French identity, and periphery, Muslim difference. Such essentialization misunderstands the fact that difference is only difference to identity, and that the poles of difference and identity are inherently unstable, determined only by perspective. Difference, in other words, is always relational and constantly shifting, never essential, something Muslim French seem to recognize better than many political theorists. By refusing their designation as essential difference, and by understanding difference not as deviation, but as variation or particularity, Muslim French radically disrupt the fixedness of identity as French and the overdetermination of Muslim religiosity as difference. And finally, by refusing an a priori majority and minority, the polity envisioned by many Muslim French also refuses, almost by definition, any stable or unified political formations. Explaining the CMF's alliances with other progressive groups, Eunice, who I mentioned earlier, Eunice told me that there are bridges that can unite disparate groups. For example, he continued, and I'm going to quote him at length, for example, for me personally, on a religious level, I'm not going to defend gay marriage. Even if you say it's universal, I don't share in this universality, which is an interesting thing to say, right? It's universal, but I don't share in this universality. On the other hand, if you say to me, we're going to fight for equal treatment between men and women, I agree. We're going to fight for equality between rich and poor nations, okay. That is to say, I have my corpus of references and I find bridges with others. We'll fight together, at least according to the minimal values that we share, unquote. Now, my goal here is not to defend the anti-same-sex marriage position of Eunice and the CMF, or to imply that all Muslim French are anti-same-sex marriage. Like the rest of the French population, Muslim French were divided on this question. What I want, rather, to highlight is how Muslim French activists like Eunice are able to work with various progressive groups on specific projects, even though they do not share the same agenda across multiple political terrains. There are certainly difficulties that have to be negotiated in these spaces of radical heterogeneity, But I want to underscore the extent to which Muslim French, like Eunice, reject any a priori notion of political unity or oneness in a way that radically disaggregates the political itself. Instead, Muslim French like Farid and Eunice embrace a future of ad hoc political formations that by definition cannot unite everyone, that constantly shift into new political constellations, and that encompass at various times and across various issues different parts of the whole. In so doing, they open a future of possibilities that seems to exceed available analytical and political frameworks. So I want to end with another anecdote from the field, this time at a January 2004 event at the Sorbonne in Paris. The Stasi Commission, inaugurated by then President Jacques Chirac to study threats to French secularism, or laïcité, had just submitted its report, including a proposal to ban conspicuous religious signs in public schools, which of course was taken up by the legislature in a few months, and the law banning conspicuous religious signs in public schools was passed. A number of the Commission's members, including its president Bernard Stasi, spoke at the event and highlighted the need to protect France from Muslim communalism, or communautarisme. In the audience were 4 members of the Muslim Students of France, or EMF, which one of the panelists had earlier referred to as a communalist organization, right, directly. At the end of the event, as he stepped down from the dais, Bernard Stasi said very loudly and very earnestly, shaking his fist, and the sort of violence of the one fist was quite symbolic, I think. Shaking his fist, he said, "Vive la République, long live the Republic." The EMF students who were standing near the stage responded, "Yes, long live the Republic, vive la République." One of them, named Assia, then quickly added, and I'll end here, Assia added just as loudly and just as earnestly, "Vive la République plurielle, long live the plural Republic." Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your thought. It was very enlightening. I'm curious though, you use the terms progressive and liberals quite frequently when defining certain Muslims. What is your anthropological barometer when you use those terms?
How do I define progressive?
Yeah, because
well,
I mean,
I actually use progressive to talk more about kind of secular progressive, classically secular progressive organizations.
Okay.
Meaning organizations, I'm using a definition, I mean, I take your point, I'm using a definition that is sort of a mainstream understanding of politically progressive, generally far left, but not necessarily hyper-secularist.
Yeah, because that in itself is some sort of difference, if you know what I mean.
In what sense?
I mean, you were talking the whole time about the establishing an indifference as opposed to a difference. I mean, it was not your argument for or against, but it was obviously an anthropological definition of the term. So I was curious just to see what you were going for when you meant progressive liberal. Were you going with some particular frame of thought, or was it just a mainstream?
No, I meant kind of across the political spectrum, right? So when I refer to the conservative UMP party, the socialists, and then
Generally accepted.
I'm sorry?
A generally accepted term for
yes,
progressive.
for progressive. But I think it's worth, one of the things I try to do in my book is unpack actually what progressive means within the Muslim French community, right? Because there are, and it is a term, and you're right that I myself, I think, kind of go back and forth between the mainstream definition of progressive and a more thought out definition of what I mean by progressive. So thank you for that question.
Oh, no worries. Looking forward to the book.
So thank you for the talk. I had 2 questions. One relating to the plurality within the Muslim community. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there are differences between Arab, Maghrebi, African, Islam's, gender, class, year of migration. So how do those differences kind of encourage conversations about nation, indifference within the Muslim community? Mm-hmm. And the second question that I had to do with something that you talked about, but sort of I wanted to hear more, which is about alliances. So you mentioned, the Pink Panthers being sort of rejected by certain groups, but then you also mentioned that, in Nous sommes la nation, there are images of Orthodox Jews that also wear the head cover. So if you can shed some light on the debates about who do the sort of your Muslim activists and people that you talk to think about alliances and how they conceptualize it, that would be very useful. And thank you again.
Thank you for those two questions. Yeah, differences within the Muslim community. I mean, there is no Muslim community, right? And I didn't mean to imply that there was a Muslim community and there are Muslim communities. One of the ways of, for me at least, of thinking not so much sociologically and demographically about these various Muslim communities was to come up with this notion of Muslim French, which is not so much a kind of well, it is demographic in the sense that it's generational, but what I'm trying to do is to transcend some of these kind of national ethnic distinctions that obviously operate in France, but are also sought to be overcome by many of my Muslim French interlocutors who are. It's a tricky balancing act, right? Because they want, on the one hand, to emphasize the fact that they are French, without necessarily forgetting where they're coming from, right? The fact that they are of Algerian origin, or Moroccan origin, or Tunisian origin, or Senegalese, or whatever. But what I was trying to do was really to track a kind of generational shift. But Muslim communities in France are vast. There are, different trends within Sunni Islam. There are for those of you who may be unfamiliar with France, most Muslims in France are of Maghrebi descent, but there are also South Asian Muslims, there are West African Muslims, there are Antillean Muslims, there are, Indonesian, it's vast. And one of the interesting things is that, and this is going a little bit off topic, but one of the interesting things is the way the French state has had real difficulty in sort of conceptualizing this diversity, because it understands, it has sort of Catholicism as its model of religion, right? Where it's very clear who represents these Catholics, and in France it's just this kind of free for all where there isn't necessarily a single, it's not clear exactly. There's no one unitary body. There's no one hierarchy. So I don't know if that answered your first question. Your second question about alliances, it's one of the things that I spent a lot of time, I didn't really have time to talk about it here, and I'm glad that you asked. One of the things that I was struck by during my fieldwork was just how these alliances are constantly shifting. And they're political alliances for the most part. And there are, groups that work together over a period of 2 years will then suddenly decide that they don't want to work together and find other alliances. But one of the most interesting things, for me at least, just intellectually and anthropologically, was watching or kind of seeing how the various tensions that emerge out of these very heterogeneous political alliances, people with very different kinds of, they may have certain similar political attachments, but not necessarily moral, ethical ones. Observing how they negotiated those. And it was often quite, not antagonistic, but agonistic, right? And one of the things that I write about in the book, and I'm going to kind of start saying, but I do that in the book, is how these kinds of political alliances are negotiated, and how. So one of the things that came up during a lot of these progressive, leftist groups that Muslim French were working with had defended Muslim girls' right to wear the headscarf in public schools. But then they turned around and said, well, we defended your right to wear a headscarf in public schools, you need to defend our right to abortion and to same-sex marriage, right? Quid pro quo. And a lot of my Muslim French interlocutors were like, we can't do that, right? We can't do that. And so that's those sorts of conflicts are something that I try to trace in the last chapter of my book. But and it's in some ways it's much more interesting because at least there's a conversation about it, right? And you see these kinds of tensions that exist in any political formation occurring. And what was interesting to me was just that there was at least an openness to working with people who did not share all of your political and ethical values.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayanthi, for the talk and for bringing back to my memory many things that happened in the past 10 years. I guess that I'm going to be the native informant, and I mean it in many ways. My parents were native in Algeria, and I'm now a university professor, Algerian and French, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't go into the whole details. But from that point of view, I just wanted to ask you something in order to understand quite well what you mean by the right to indifference. If I get you right, I think there might be a difference between what was claimed 10 years ago and what now could be claimed. Let me put it that way. I think that and you tell me what you think. I think that what would be today's claim would be to claim the right to indifference from others who claim the right to point at difference. I mean, it's just to claim a right to claim a difference that is a matter of pride. That is to say, there are two things going on at the same time. The right to claim difference as something that is a matter of pride, and the right to dismiss any kind of judgment on that difference from anyone that considers itself or himself from the dominant group. That is to say, I want my difference to be visible, but it doesn't have to be any kind of debate about that in the public sphere. You don't have to question my difference, the way it looks at you, and so I claim the right to deny you the right to question my difference. So that would be a little bit more complex than just the right to indifference, because it's a matter of claiming the pride of difference, and I would illustrate that.
I would argue that that's happening even 10 years ago, right? The right to indifference doesn't mean that the right to indifference is precisely that. I get to be whoever I am, but I don't want to debate about it in the public sphere. I want people to be indifferent to my difference, right? My so-called difference.
But I think that it's even more powerfully proposed now, and I would give the example of the demonstration of yesterday, La Marche de la Dignité, that took place on Saturday. And what is interesting is that all differences and plurality of France, and of course heterogeneity, were there. And one of the main claims was that there's no question about who we are, how we look, and how we connect to each other, which will bring me to the other question about alliances. And I think that this is something quite unusual, because I think that there's a maturity and some sort of a 10-year-long process that has been, in some way expressed yesterday, that has to do with the fact that there's no way any question can be asked anymore about differences, about any kind of expressions of singularity. And I think that singularity is something that goes along with plurality in France now. And my other point would be about alliances. And I think that they come from below, which is something that has to be also stressed, because there has been a lot of division in the past 10 years. And also on the points that you raised, this has been a matter of dividing. And unusually or surprisingly, yesterday in the demonstration, in this march, there was also claims about standing by queers of color, including Muslims, which is something that was supposed to be totally unlikely to happen in a few years back. So I just wanted to add this to the reflection, because I think that this notion that Islamophobia is very common among France, and that homophobia is only the exclusivity, as you showed, of the Muslims, is something that brought to the assumption that, of course, they would never stand by queers and by people who claim their rights from a sexual singularity position.
Right. I think we are in agreement in the sense that I think there's a clear sort of line, right, a genealogical line in the past 10 years, and perhaps has been a sort of maturation. And I mean, your point about I think alliances themselves have also shifted, and the kinds of communities that are being created have also shifted, and the kind of alliances that are possible now have also shifted. And I think that's absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. This is really amazing. What I wanted to ask is actually related to the question of, there is a certain history here that there is change, there is transformation, and I want to think about the relationship between the idea of the Muslim communities vis-a-vis the so-called progressive left. After all, as we know, exactly what we're describing, you and Nasira are talking about, is a phenomenon that just late 90s were described by Pierre Bourdieu and Louis Quaquin as, God forbid, Anglo-Saxon multiculturalism in a kind of a paradoxical term. So there is a shift in the public sphere to even allow that type of demonstration and discourse to enter leftist French debate rather than be seen suddenly as conforming to some expert of discourses of identity that are threatening to the La République. So my question is really about where is the place of the non-Muslim left in relation to the space of Muslim communities, on the one hand claiming the nation, but on the other hand, the idea of the universal as seen by leftist discourse that was quite defensive of La République and universalism in ways that echoed actually right-wing discourse.
Right.
So I'd like to speak about in your research, how do you negotiate those
Yeah, I mean,
stances,
I think, well, so the left in France is obviously diverse, right? And one of the things I think that has been interesting is not the right word, but revelatory is just how much religion, and Islam in particular, has been a sticking point for the embrace of minority rights. And so you're absolutely right, there's a way in which the universalism of the Republican left, ends up mimicking a lot of the kind of right-wing discourse. I think that the difference in some ways is that, at least for the kind of universalism of republicanism demands the integrated Muslim subject in a way that right-wing, just full-on right-wing discourse does not, right? And so you see, I mean, Nasira, you've written about this, but the way in which secular republicanism, it can't just fully reject Muslims or Arabs as not French, because the universalism of republicanism demands a kind of conversion possibility. And so it demands that there be certain subjects who convert to republicanism, right? Because that is what indicates the universalism of republicanism. And so what's been interesting in France is and I think, Nasir, you mentioned this morning, but the emergence of these kind of integrated figures who are held up as in some ways as the ideal Republicans, right? Precisely because they mark the universality of republicanism by dint of the fact that they were Arab, Muslim, et cetera, but have kind of converted to republicanism, which marks the universality of republicanism. And I think within the far left as well, there's been a splintering on the question of certainly the Islamic headscarf, right? And it's been it's in that sense, it's been revelatory because of the lack of allies on the left for many minority Muslim communities. That's one of the things that I think many of these people and these activists have to sort of work with. So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but the question of the universalism of the left, I think, is an interesting one, because I do actually try to think through this, but I think in that sense it is distinct from a kind of right-wing cultural purity, discourse of cultural purity and of French identity, which is not actually universalist, right? And it doesn't require the integrated Muslim Maghrebi subject in the way that universalist republicanism, leftist republicanism does.
Thank you for your presentation, and also for what I consider to be an extraordinary book. And I would just get your perspective about something that you talk about in your book that you didn't talk about much tonight, and that is the issue of laïcité. Mm-hmm. Because after reading your comments about laïcité, it made me think differently about that notion. And I think there's a major intervention in the literature. And I would say that the notion, when one looks at laïcité in terms of a kind of a political philosophy, and we can map the logic in it. But you turned it on its head and enabled us to look differently at this. And it becomes almost a technology of oppression that often polices the Muslim community in terms of its religiosity and its spiritual practices. And I thought that was really brilliant the way you actually did that. And I know I'm probably being overly determined in my analysis of it, but that made me think differently about the notion, a kind of new gaze, if you will, in terms of how one looks at laïcité as opposed to looking at it as looking at its intrinsic logic and making sense that this is something that is really beneficial for the society. But in fact, it really is oppressive for the Muslim community.
Thank you also for the compliment. For those of you, I mean, basically and I didn't talk about secularism and laïcité here, but my basic argument is that secularism, we understand secularism as the separation of church and state, of religion and politics, but secularism, in the French case, and I would argue everywhere, is not so much the separation of the religious from the political, but the administrative intervention into and regulation of religious life by political government, basically. And so, and the other part of the argument is that, in France, secularism is understood as neutrality in front of religious diversity, and secularism elsewhere also is understood as kind of neutrality. And part of the argument that I try to make is that the secular state can only be neutral towards subjects that are worthy of its neutrality, that don't present the kinds of problems, right? And so in the same way that Jewish emancipation radically transformed Judaism and turned it into merely a religion rather than also law, one sees a similar transformation of Islam in France and the kind of remaking of Islam and Muslims into subjects towards whom the state can be neutral, right? But that requires a kind of massive intervention into and regulation of Muslim life in order to turn Islam into an acceptable religion in France. So I think that's the argument that you were making, that you were invoking. Yeah, so thank you. I think there's a question over there. And Justin, you'll tell me when we're time, right?
I will. Okay. Yeah, this is actually going to be the last question.
Okay, last question, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
What's the reaction of the French Republicans to African Muslims plus African who are not Muslim? Many of them live in France. What's the reaction to these two communities?
This is a great question. And one of the interesting things about France and the racialization, I mean, the relationship between race and religion is that there's something sort of essential about the Arab Muslim. I mean, in the Arab is always a racialized and figure of religion and race, right? Religiously and racially other. And the kind of Muslimness and Arabness are tightly interwoven in the French imagination, and this has a long colonial history. But similar to that is also a long colonial history of France and the French Empire looking at its African subjects as never fully quite Muslim. They were black, right? They were sort of figures of race upon whom Islam was a sort of surface ascription. And this, I think, had continued into the present, but I would say that it's, I mean, and Nasir, you can help me out here, but I think it's shifting. I think there is increasingly a way in which blackness is also now associated with Muslimness precisely through African Muslims. But the kind of othering, the forms that Muslim otherness takes in the political and symbolic imagination are different, right? So African Muslims are associated with polygamy and excision, and having, you know, sort of lots of children and lots of wives, basically. Whereas Arab Muslims are still understood largely as a problem of terrorism and Islamism. And so the figure of the Muslim is split racially. But what's interesting has been the shift from a kind of long understanding of the African Muslim as, you know, not really Muslim, but rather black, to something else, something different that's happening now.